Petro will speak about some critical vulnerabilities and all the way from their past, present, and also help us identify these vulnerability patterns for the future and the reason why and in what circumstances they keep occurring. And a little bit about him. I've known him for some time now. He's quite a humble person and is also very super fast email responder. Petro enjoys finding vulnerabilities in software and hardware devices and writing exploits for them. And he publishes those exploits for free of charge on GitHub. He also regularly participates in the Pwn2Own hacking competition with his colleague as the Flashback team. In a recent Pwn2Own Tokyo 2020 competition, he, along with his colleague, were crowned the Master of Pwn for the event, meaning outright winners for the competition. A fun fact about him, Pedro has found over 200 vulnerabilities and published over 60 exploits on GitHub. I'll share his GitHub URL in the chat very soon. And all right, I hope everyone is as thrilled as I am. And please share your questions in the LinkedIn chat, and I'll take as many as I can towards the end of this talk. So Pedro, if you're ready, let's jump right in. And sorry for the delay.
No problem. Hello, everyone. So I'll start by sharing my screen. So let's hope everything is okay and you can all see. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate your time. I hope you'll find this interesting. I'm going to try and take this find a good pace so I can, inform people who are not, very deep into exploitation and others who are very deep. So we'll try to find a balance. So today we're going to talk about critical vulnerabilities in network equipment, past, present, and future. So what has happened before, what is happening now, and what I expect for the future. So Bablu already did a good introduction. And first of all, thank you, Bablu, very much for this opportunity. It was a pleasure to be here. So my day job is basically I'm a director at Agile Information Security. So we're a boutique security consultancy. What I mean by this is we're a small consultancy, but highly technical. We focus on penetration testing, reverse engineering, vulnerability research, and product security. As Bablu said, I have published a lot of vulnerabilities before, and my focus as a security research and vulnerability researcher is on embedded systems and Java. Two very opposite fields, but that's why I like them, because they're so different. They keep me interested going from one to the other. And today we're going to talk about embedded systems. And when I say embedded systems, think of it as Internet of Things, IoT, embedded systems. They all mean the same. So we're basically talking about all the computers around you. They can be smartphones, they can be laptops, they can be your smartwatch, your game console, your TV, whatever. Also, yes, as Bablu said, I participate with my colleague Radek Dolmansky in Pwn2Own. We've been participating since 2019. And we also have a YouTube channel. We're wannabe YouTubers. So have a look. These are quite technical videos. So I guess most people may be too long and too technical for them. But if you're a hacker that likes to go deep in technical stuff, you might like this. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's think about what we're going to talk today. So as I said before, one of the things I specialize is embedded devices. And in this category, you can include network equipment. So network equipment, we can call it network devices. So routers, firewalls, web application firewalls, VPN terminators, XSL accelerator, switches, etc. All of this, and can be both for home and enterprise. So in this picture, as you can see, I put some examples. On the left-hand side, we have some home stuff. Then here we start to have some SME stuff. And then we have the proper enterprise stuff. So these are devices that go from, like $50 that this router costs to maybe, I don't know the prices, but let's say $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, maybe more. I heard about $100,000 for some enterprise network devices. But actually, okay, let's take a step back. In reality, this talk is about network devices, but we're only going to talk about routers today. Okay, and why? Why do you ask? So routers, they're very similar to any kind of other kind of network devices. They're I like to think of them as the CTF of embedded devices and network devices in particular, because these devices, the ones we saw in the previous slide, whether they cost $100 or $100,000, obviously the $100,000 one is going to have a lot of bells and whistles and custom hardware, but deep down they're quite similar in a lot of ways. So they have similar technology, they have similar security protections, and they have similar vulnerabilities. And it doesn't really matter for what you're going to hear today, is based off my experience with routers. But trust me when I say this applies also to enterprise network devices, which can cost up to $100,000 or more. And if you don't trust me, don't worry, I got examples for that to show you. So before we actually get into it, let's think a bit. So, okay, if what I said is true, let's just imagine it is true for now. Why are there more published vulnerabilities in routers than in enterprise network equipment, right? If I say they're the same, this one is equal to this one in terms of security, why there's so many more vulnerabilities in this one? Simple. It's very easy for me as a hacker to go to a tech shop and buy $100 router, right? How easy it is to buy a $50,000 of enterprise equipment. Even if I had the money, which I don't, I need to go through their vendor assessment. I need to sign contracts. I need to do this. So basically the point here is that for me as a hacker, the one who has the expertise to attack these network devices is much harder to get an enterprise device. So obviously I'm going to find a lot more vulnerabilities in a router. But this does not mean that the enterprise device is more secure. It just means that it's harder for people like me and you to get it, right? And during this presentation, I'm hoping I can convince you that actually these devices are the same in terms of security. And in some cases, the router is more secure. Okay, so let's start then the proper presentation, critical vulnerabilities in routers, past, present, and future. So before we start, let's talk about some important definitions. So again, remember, we're focusing on routers, but all of this applies to large enterprise devices. In routers, we usually have two domains. So one is called the wide area network. This connects to the internet and to the wider network. And then we have the LAN, the internal trusted network, right? So basically, as you can see in this router picture, they're physically separate, right? We have the WAN. This is where the internet comes in. You get this router, you connect this port to your internet, and you connect here to the other Ethernet ports, your devices, or to the Wi-Fi. So the Wi-Fi and the devices are inside the LAN, whereas the WAN is what comes from the outside and connects to the internet or your ISP. In terms of vulnerabilities, obviously, one vulnerabilities on consumer-grade routers are internet exploitable. What this means is that if there's a vulnerability that is exploitable from the WAN, the internet side, then you're done, you're toasted because the hacker can exploit it. Whereas the LAN vulnerability is only exploitable locally. So, only someone inside of your internal network can exploit a LAN vulnerability. And you say, okay, this means that LAN vulnerabilities are not really important, right? Because only someone in my network, which I trust, can exploit it. Yes, if you think about your home. But a lot of these routers, and if you go to the enterprise ones, they are put in very large internal networks, right? So in a coffee shop, not necessarily everyone can be trusted. So there have been reports, unconfirmed, that some intelligence agencies have been able to penetrate cyber cafes used by terrorists, plant LAN vulnerabilities in the router, take control of the router, and then monitor the terrorist communications when the terrorists go to the cyber cafe to do whatever they do and communicate with their friends. Another thing to have in mind is that some ISP distribute routers to their customers. So if there's a vulnerability in a router ISP, it affects millions of customers at once. And I don't think there's any doubt that router's vulnerabilities have become much more important during this work from home pandemic days, right? So let's start by talking about the past. What is the past? I call the past everything before 2016. Why 2016? Well, it's a bit arbitrary, but things started to improve around 2015, 16. So let's start by presenting a couple of old vulnerabilities which have a lot of impact and kind of show how things were before. So let's start by CV 2012-5958 to 5965, which affects the portable SDK for UPnP devices. So these are multiple vulnerabilities that result in pre-authentication remote code execution over the WAN. What this means is that Rapid7, so you might know this company, they're famous because they actually purchased Metasploit, the exploit framework. Their researchers discovered this in 2012. And at the time, there were 23 million systems exposed on the internet which could be exploited. And the root cause of this is software development kit reuse, a recurring problem which still happens to this day. So what is the software development kit? We'll go into that in a bit more detail, but think of it this way. When a router manufacturers make their own device, right, they don't build everything from scratch, so they can use Linux to put on the device. They can use different software libraries, right? And many times they use certain chipsets, let's say a Realtek Wi-Fi chipset, an Atheros one, etc. And these chipsets need to be programmed for the router. They need to have drivers. And these drivers and these programs are made using the SDK provided by the chipset vendor. So in this case, there was a chipset or a board vendor, the board that manufacturers use as the base to make their devices, that provided software development kit for the manufacturers to then build on top of this. And there was a vulnerability affecting this SDK. And because of this, all the manufacturers that use this SDK were vulnerable to this. So the vulnerabilities itself, as I say, there are many. You saw from the number of CVEs, we're talking about, I don't know, maybe 10 different vulnerabilities. And here you have a brief example of what they are. So if you know anything about vulnerability and if you've seen this pattern before, you see here a string and copy. And a string copy. So this basically is input that comes from the user, or let's say from the internet, and then gets copied directly to a data structure without validation. So if you understand buffer overflows, you know straight away this is exploitable. This means that someone sends a request to the router over the internet. The router just takes this request and copies it to its internal memory without any validation. And this allows a hacker to take control of the system. So this, as I said, is exploitable over the WAN, so over the internet. And at the time, in 2013, which is the date this was discovered, there were no binary protections in routers at all. So there was no NX, ASLR, which are binary protections we'll talk about later. And unfortunately, we can still find similar vulnerabilities in some of today's routers, but they're mostly gone. The benefit of this as a hacker is that you just really need to write your exploit once, and it runs on all the affected devices, 23 million. Well, there'll be different manufacturers with slight changes, but you get what I mean. It's very easy to build an exploit for this that can be mass deployed over the internet and used for a botnet or whatever. So this was the vulnerability we just discussed. Now let's talk about another old one, which is very interesting. This one is called Misfortune Cookie, also known as CV 2014-92222. So this is vulnerabilities in Allegro Soft ROM pager, an embedded HTTP server. This is an embedded HTTP server that runs on several routers and is used by your ISP to administer your router, right? So think about it this way. The ISP gives you a router, but they have to do firmware upgrades, right? If you have your own router, you can do a firmware upgrade yourself. But think about your mom or your grandpa. When they have internet, they're not going to upgrade their router, right? But the ISP has to have a way to upgrade their router so that they can just introduce new functionality or fix security problems if they care. And this Allegro Soft ROM pager was an embedded HTTP server that allowed the ISP to communicate with your router over the WAN in order to do these upgrades and make these modifications in your router. So this was called the TR-069 protocol. This vulnerability was actually fixed in 2005, but only discovered in 2014. And why? Because again, as we discussed in the previous one, this was a vulnerability in an SDK, a different one than before. Like I said, when a router manufacturer, let's say Netgear, they build their own router, they use a board made by a third company. This company provides a software development kit, and they do this to ASUS, Netgear, TP-Link, all the router manufacturers. So all of them were affected because they all share this base SDK. And the problem here is, even though the vulnerability was fixed in 2005, it was not fixed inside the SDK until 2014. Okay, what makes this an interesting one? This is an arbitrary memory write through the cookie. So if you know HTTP protocol, you send a request, and in this request, there's a cookie. So it's very, very interesting vulnerability. So I'm not going to go into details in this talk because that would take too long. But here's an idea for you to have. So here's the cookie that gets into the request, and this is the memory address you want to write, and this is what you want to write to it. So you can see, as a hacker, this is a dream come true. You basically send a request to the router, and you can override the memory. And if you remember from the previous one, if you can override memory in the router, we can take control of the router. Simple, right? At the time, 12 million systems exposed on the internet, mostly routers. And as I explained, the root cause is SDK reuse, insecure SDK reuse, a recurring problem which still happens to this day. So again, I explained this before, but let's just go through it very quickly. So a lot of network equipment, let's say produced by D-Link, Netgear, ASUS, whatever router manufacturers, are not made by them, actually. They're made by companies, most of them in China, which make a base router. And then what TP-Link, Netgear does is that they change the shell around the router. So they make the router with their own logo and stuff. But the base inside the router and the software is the same. It just changes the UI a little bit. So this allows them to produce very cheap routers, right? And as you can imagine, this is very cheap to produce. But because it's very cheap to produce, it also means they don't pay their employees well. It also means they don't care about security or do security testing. Cheap code, lots of vulnerabilities. And a lot of these companies that make these routers, they disappear after 5 years. And then there's no support, and D-Link or Netgear cannot do any updates, and they're stuck. And they don't care. D-Link or Netgear, they don't care because they want to sell you a router for $10. They're not going to care about something that costs $10, right? But, leads to problems like this. So things are starting to change these days. So what I described before about the SDK used to happen more in the past is not so common now in the future. Now what we have is that companies like Netgear, TP-Link, etc., they have their own platform in-house. They have their own SDK just for their brand, especially for the mid and high-end network equipment. But as we will see, if you had a problem in an SDK, a lot of manufacturers were affected because they share the same base. Now, because a manufacturer shares the same base across all their routers, then this means that all the routers are affected if you find a vulnerability, as we will see. So let's move on. And in the past, there were one internet side vulnerabilities everywhere. And before we move on, so remember what I told you, that the enterprise network equipment is just as vulnerable as the consumer one. Well, and then I said, okay, if you doubt me, I'll show you proof. So here's one example. So this is a vulnerability discovered by Orange Tsai and Meshan, two very famous researchers. And they discovered a vulnerability in the Palo Alto Network's Global Protect Secure Socket Layer SSL VPN accelerator. So this is an enterprise device, costs a lot of money. I don't know how, but certainly above $20,000, which used by many large companies in the world. And what they found was a format string vulnerability. So if you're not familiar with a format string vulnerability, this is the most basic vulnerability ever that has been in existence since the 1980s. And it doesn't exist almost anywhere in software today. So basic it is. And this was found in a highly expensive, widely used enterprise device. And if you see here, this is just the brief showing how the exploitation is done. You basically just send a post request unauthenticated to the device with the format string, and you can exploit it. This is a joke, as you can see. It's a joke of easy to exploit. It's easier to exploit than the router vulnerabilities we just spoke about. So as you can see, here's one example of how enterprise devices can be just as vulnerable as the home ones. We'll have more later. But now let's move on and talk about the present. Present is 2016 to 2020 X. I say X because it's hard to say when the transition is already happening. Hard to say exactly when it'll be concluded, but routers are getting better. At some point, they will reach this maturity stage. So here's the good part. Things are definitely improving. NX is very common these days. So NX is a technique that locks down certain areas of memory and makes them not executable. This means if you had vulnerabilities like before, where you could overwrite certain sections of the memory, you don't get automatic control of the device. You have to do a few more tricks. On top of that, we have ASLR, address space layer randomization. So this is another protection technique that works in the following way. When a program starts on your computer, it does not start at a fixed memory address. It basically, every time it starts at a different one. Why this matters? Because again, if you have a vulnerability like the ones I described, where you overwrite memory, in order to take control of the device, you need to know where you are in the memory. And if you don't have ASLR, it's very easy to know where you are, because every time you reboot the router, you're in the same space. But with ASLR, it changes. So this makes also some vulnerabilities not exploitable depending on how they are. But there's a way to bypass these protections, as we will see. Another good thing is that finally manufacturers understand they cannot leave the one doors open. They cannot leave the internet exposed one side, where all the traffic comes in untrusted, open to the wide world. So now some routers completely lock it down. They have a firewall. They don't let any traffic in. They only let traffic go out as it should be. And ISP also have improved. They have a lot of better threat detection. They protect their customers better. And they have this thing called CGNAT, which we'll explain now. So basically, CGNAT is not a protection technology, but is more like a network address translation technology. So if you're not, this is called NAT. If you're not familiar with NAT, it's basically how you can communicate from inside your internal network to the outside world, and the outside world can talk to you. It's basically, like the name implies, a translation of addresses. So what this does is that the CGNAT is like a ISP-wide internal network. What this means in practice is that someone from the outside, not from your ISP, someone on the internet, cannot connect directly to your router. So this kills off a lot of these WAN vulnerabilities like the ones we discussed before. However, not all ISPs have this. And this sometimes is not behavior that you want. For example, if you have a server running on your internal network you want to expose to the outside, you want people to connect to it. It might, I know it's a use case not many people use, but, I had to do this. So for some people, this is actually not desirable. So let's talk about vulnerabilities in the present, so to speak. The first one is a vulnerability I found in 2016. And the reason it is interesting is because it kind of shows the transition from the earlier, easier ones to these more advanced ones. So this is basically a multi-architecture stack buffer overflow. So this affects several D-Link router models, more than 10, and it is exploitable only on the LAN side, so only on the internal network. And what makes this interesting is, like I said before, when you had an SDK, and this SDK was shared by many vendors, you had a vulnerability affecting many vendors, and now it's different. the vendor itself has their own platform, and they share this platform across all their router line, right? So this is an example of that. And these routers, they have different CPUs. So some have MIPS CPU, some have ARM CPU. However, they're all vulnerable to the same exploit. And you might not understand why this is a big deal, but think of it this way. If the architecture, the CPU architecture is different, the exploit is completely different. It has to be rewritten from scratch. So this is just an old school stack buffer overflow, similar to the ones we saw before, but we use some techniques to bypass NX, as I explained, and we use some technique to bypass ASLR. To bypass NX, we use rope, which is quite interesting. I'm not going to explain it here. I recommend you read it offline because it's quite complicated. I am going to explain a bit about ASLR later. And this is the vulnerability. So as you can see, this is a simplified version of the vulnerability. The real one is a bit more complex. But anyway, this is a function. We have here a stack variable 2048 in size. And we have this XML document being sent. So this is sent by the attacker to the router. And then what this code does is it basically, like the one before, it copies the XML directly into a stack variable. So if we send more than 2048 bytes, it overwrites it. And this interesting thing, or let's say the stupid thing here, is that they actually calculate how long the attacker string is. What I mean by this is that usually they should be checking if the string is longer than 2048, don't copy, but they don't do that. They just use whatever we send. So we can override the memory, right? And we can use some tricks to bypass NX, as like I explained. But what about ASLR? What about what I explained, that every time you restart a process in your computer, the address in memory changes? Like I said, if we're overriding memory, trying to take control of the device, we need to know where we are in the memory. However, in these kind of devices, the ASLR is very weak. So the address only changes in 3 bytes. In theory, this is 24 bits of entropy. In practice, it's only 12 because of some restrictions. So this only leaves us 4,096 possibilities. What this means is that we have 1 in 4,096 chances to know where we are in memory when we test. And here you have a screenshot. As you can see, the memory layout is always BF at the start and 3 zeros at the end. So only 3 bytes change, right? So how can we exploit this, right? We still have to hit the right memory address. Well, a lot of these network daemons, what they do is when they receive a request, they fork into another process, meaning the main process is running and they create a secondary process to deal with the request. This is used so if they receive 100 requests, they can all deal with them and they're not busy with one and ignore 99. So what this means is that we have a second process where our exploit is running, where we override the memory, and then we try to hit the memory at a certain location. And if it fails, the secondary process dies, but the first one's still running. So if you're still following, this means we can try infinite times to find out the memory address, and we won't kill our exploit until we finally hit it and we finally take control of the device. And if you're interested in this, you can follow these links. They're in my GitHub. We'll share after this. So another interesting thing we need to talk about is logical vulnerabilities. So all these vulnerabilities I explained, they're all memory corruption vulnerabilities, copying, overriding memory, etc. That's very interesting, and they're very interesting vulnerabilities, but they're not very scalable. They're hard to write exploits for, etc. So now I'm going to show you some what I call logical vulnerabilities. These result from an incorrect application logic. So first we have an authentication bypass, and then we have a configuration override. The CVs are here. And this at the time in 2018 affect all mid and high-end ISIS routers. So I don't know how many, but more than 20. And you see a pattern here, like D-Link, all these ASUS routers, they share the same platform. ASUS has their platform to develop routers, and they have 30 routers developed on the same platform. So one vulnerability that affects one affects all of them. And here we have, so I'm not going to go over this code, but basically this is the code that handles the HTTP requests, when you make a request to the web server. And what this does is does an authentication check, so checks your password. And if the password is wrong, instead of kicking you out to the login page, it first checks if you're sending a post request, HTTP post. And if you do, weirdly, it handles your post request even though you didn't pass authentication. So this is what we call the authentication bypass. The router is supposed to reject you if you don't have the right authentication. However, if you go down a certain path in the code, if you know what to send, you can bypass this. And here we have the second vulnerability. Again, not going to go over through this, it's very complicated, but this is you post to a certain page. And what this page does is it allows you to overwrite configuration variables. So now you can see the pattern here. If we can bypass authentication and we can hit this special page without authentication, we can override configuration variables in the router. So what can we achieve with this? Simple. First, we send an HTTP post to bypass authentication to this VPN upload CGI. This is the code that was handled before here. So we bypass authentication, we send a post request, and we override variables. What do we overwrite? The router's administrative password. And once we have the administrative password, we can SSH into the router's root, and we can also use some other tools that ASUS has to manage the router that allow us to take over and achieve remote code execution. As you can see, no need for memory corruption, no need to complicate the memory bypasses, easy root on the device. And what about OneSide vulnerabilities? Do they still exist these days? Yes, they do. They're mostly firewall bypasses. So here you have one of our latest vulnerabilities found by me and my colleague Radek that allow a firewall bypass on the TP-Link Archer A7 that allows an attacker to exploit over the internet. So this specific is with regards to IPv6. So IPv4 was locked down, the one side, so the internet side of IPv4 you couldn't enter. But if you knew how to enter from IPv6, you got in. So I can't talk much more about this vulnerability because we will have a video later about it. But what I just explained is the basics. So what these vulnerabilities have in common? There's no more multi-vendor SDK like we had in the past, so no more multi-vendor vulnerabilities. But now each vendor has a common platform for their devices. So if you own one device from the vendor, you own all devices from that vendor. And in the present, we got LAN vulnerabilities everywhere. So talk again about, okay, this is all nice, Pedro, fine, but what about enterprise equipment? Well, here's some very recent vulnerabilities from March this year on F5 big IP appliances. Again, appliances that cost dozens of thousands of dollars. And I'm not going to go over the bugs. You can check this later, but these are very simple exploits. I mean, this one is command injection, the most basic type ever. Really, I mean, this is, again, these vulnerabilities I'm showing you here, I'm not going to go over them. You can go over them later, but they are simpler than the ones I just explained. And equipment that costs 100 times more, 1,000 times more, I don't even know. And more examples here for more enterprise equipment, Cisco stuff, costs dozens of thousands of dollars. So also very simple stuff. Now, okay. We still have some time, thankfully. So let's talk about the future. The future is post this 2020X, which might be 2024, 5, something like that. What's going to happen in the future with regards to these? So I expect LAN vulnerabilities will become harder to find and exploit. With 64-bit ASLR, we cannot use the tricks that we used before because the address space is so big, we cannot try infinite times to try to get our memory corruption right. We have protection like stack cookies, railroad, pointer signing, all of these more high-end protections being implemented in network equipment. So these make exploitation of memory corruption vulnerabilities, like the one we saw in the past and the first one in the present, much harder to exploit. But manufacturers, they want to provide features to customers like us, right? And as you know, the more features, the less security. And there's a trade-off. In the end, they're a business, right? I mean, they should care about security, but they should also offer their customers, nice functionality in the router. The problem is the more nice functionality, the more attack surface, the more vulnerabilities. I predict a high increase in logical vulnerabilities. So this is like the last one I explained, where there's no memory corruption. It's just using tricks to bypass logic. However, manufacturers are starting to feel the pressure from government bodies, and they're starting to be forced to do proper pen testing, fuzzing, and hiring good people to do research and to secure network equipment. What about WAN vulnerabilities? Will these become impossible to exploit? Well, as I explained in the present, right now, most WAN vulnerabilities are firewall bypasses. They're more complex stuff. So those will soon be dead. And manufacturers are starting to really lock down the WAN side completely. So one thing that might happen is that ISP attacks will become more common. So the ISP, basically, they have a lot of attack surface, and they have a lot of specialized network equipment. So if you think about routers being like the consumer stuff, and then the enterprise stuff we talk about, then you have the carrier grade stuff, the ISP stuff. This is the really expensive. I mean, now we're talking about equipment that costs millions of dollars. But again, remember, if in the enterprise equipment costs thousands of dollars and hackers cannot reach it, what about the carrier grade equipment? I never touched carrier grade equipment, only enterprise one, but it is my opinion that it's going to be even worse in terms of security because of these reasons I told you before. So as attackers, what can we do next step? We have to go down the layers a notch. We have to up our game. We have to start attacking IP parsers, Ethernet, Wi-Fi, so more low-end stuff, thinking about remote kernel exploits, and focus on vendor-specific functionality. And here's an example. You got Broadphone. This is a Wi-Fi attack. Then we got the one in the iPhones, zero-click airdrop exploit. Again, attacks the Wi-Fi parser. And then a Bluetooth vulnerability. So, going lower and lower in the scale. So, solutions. As manufacturers and ISPs, large companies, we should implement all previously discussed protection technologies. We should sandbox, use Docker daemons, etc. on devices. And we should hire security specialists, internal and external, to perform audits. As a state or regulatory entity, they need to legislate and pressure manufacturers to perform penetration tests, fuzzing, security, architecture, etc. And implement a regulatory framework that can control and guide manufacturers. As individuals or small companies, then we should turn off everything that is optional and manufacture specific technologies like mesh, file sharing, etc. We should use routers with OpenWRT and DDWRT, which are open source router operating systems for your internal network, and connect them to the ISP router for internet access. So basically put a layer between you and the ISP that you trust. So let's finalize with a comparison. Do you still think enterprise network equipment is more secure than consumer routers? Let's think. What consumer routers have? Shared SDK, platform, one device is vulnerable, all devices from the same manufacturer are vulnerable. Is this true? Yes. Palo Alto, Cisco, Barracuda, they all share the same platform. When one is vulnerable, they all are. I mean, inside, when one Palo Alto is vulnerable, all Palo Altos are. When one Barracuda is vulnerable, all Barracudas are. So consumer routers, they have implicit trust, less protection on the LAN side. Is this true for enterprise network equipment? Yes. You have the LAN network, you have the management network. They are more trusted. They have the same logical separation between trusted and untrusted. And the trusted one is always less secure. Routers have inadequate binary protections, as we just explained. What about in-present equipment? Yes, you saw the vulnerability examples, sometimes even worse than routers. Routers have recently reported 90 style vulnerabilities, meaning vulnerabilities easy to find and exploit. Yes, we saw examples. What about enterprise network equipment? Yes, we saw examples. Routers are cheap and easy to acquire, available to hackers like you and me. Yes. What about consumer and enterprise network equipment? No. So same, but different. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, just let me know. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for listening. I do have a demo of an exploit. I don't know if you have time, so I'll maybe pass to Bablu now and see.
Yes, Pedro, we can do that.
We can move. Okay. So yeah. I'm gonna just bear with me a minute while you can see my terminal, but maybe very small, right? How about now? Better? Yeah, you can, right? So here, just bear with me, and I'm sorry, this is very messy here in my office. Here we have a router. This is a TP-Link A7, which was used in the Pwn2One competition. And what I'm going to demonstrate is our Pwn2One exploit, which was actually implemented into Metasploit and is available now in Metasploit if you have this router. So as you can see, I'm connected to the LAN. So this is a LAN exploit with my computer, and I'm going to turn it on. And then we're going to let the router boot. It's going to take a while. So I'm just going to put the router. You can see it's booting. I'm just going to put the router here. As you can see, I'm connected to the LAN. So this is a LAN exploit with my computer, and I'm going to turn it on. And then we're going to let the router boot. It's going to take a while. So I'm just going to, you can see it's booting. Just going to put the router. So here we have, so first I'm going to drop my firewall because my firewall doesn't allow me to do this. And now let's start the Metasploit framework. So as I said, this exploit that I'm going to demonstrate now is part of the Metasploit framework. And let's go here. I'm going to see if the router, so first I'm going to configure the computer interface so we can connect to the router. I'm going to try and ping the router. Not yet, it's still booting, as you can see here. So it's still flashing the lights. So we're going to wait a bit until the lights stop flashing. In the meantime, as I discussed, this exploit is in Metasploit right now. So if you download Metasploit right now, you are able to use this exploit if you have a similar device. This device is sold in the US and sold in Europe. I'm not sure if it's sold in Asia, but it's quite common in the US and Europe. So the router is finished. As you can see, the light has stopped blinking. So let's see if we can ping the router. Yes, we can ping the router. And I'm also going to show you the router interface. So you can see here 68.0.1. So you can see here on the right-hand side, this is TP-Link Archer A7. I put in my password. And then we're in. And let's see, what can I here in advance, maybe get some info. Yeah, so you can see it's a normal router. Maybe here, system tools, firmware upgrade. So firmware version, here you can see the firmware version is an old version, of course, but this works until early 2021, actually. So this works on a lot of firmwares. Okay, you know I have it, so let's log out. And let's go back to our terminal, which is here. We go full screen. As you can see, I can ping the router. And now let's use the TP-Link exploit. So this is the exploit name. Again, you can find it on Metasploit right now. So you got the information about it here. So made by Pedro Ribeiro, Radek Domanski. used in pwn to own, blah, blah, blah. You can read it later. So what we do is we set the target. Target IP address is 192.168.0.1. Then we set our IP address, which is 100. Then we set again our IP address to receive the reverse shell, server host. And that's pretty much it. So now let's do a check. The check contacts the router and see if it's vulnerable. Yes, it says it's vulnerable. And now let's run it. So you can read more information about this in the advisory, but what this does is it's a command injection that does 1 byte at a time. That's why it's going to take a little bit of while. And you see here the progress bar is a bit slow. Because it has inject byte by byte. It does a command injection, drops the file on the disk. And when it's finished injecting, it runs this file. And when it runs this file, it runs our exploit. So this is quite interesting. And if you like it, I recommend you read the advisory. It's quite easy to read. And this is not a vulnerability that involves any memory corruption. So it's easy to understand for someone who is not very focused on the memory corruption part, who is not a hacker with a lot of experience. So we're almost done. We're going to hit 100% soon, and we should get a reverse shell. So we hit it 100%. We wait, and don't fail me. Don't fail me, please. And here we go. Yes. Yes. No, it failed. You know how it is when we try to do something live, it also fails. Okay, let's try again. Maybe I have something from the previous attempt. Okay, let's try again. Hopefully this time will run. So this is our IP. Yes, our IP is correct. And the router is correct, so please work now. This is the thing. When you're doing it live, it always fails. And I've done this, I think, 4 times today. No problem on a freshly booted router. Hopefully this time will work. So it's injecting the command file byte by byte. Fingers crossed. Gonna work this time. Yes, it worked. We're in. As you can see, command shell opened. Now let's see. See, we're inside Linux Archer. We're root. And here's the file system. We're in. We're inside the router. If you doubt, okay, let's try maybe, I don't know if this router reboots, but let's see. So here you can see the router. Let's see if it reboots. Maybe this router doesn't have the reboot functionality. Anyway, we're in. You can see from here, we got a shell. It's all good. We have root. We win. Ah, yeah, it seems to be rebooting. Yeah, it's rebooting now. I don't know if, I hope you can see my camera. I'm not sure if this is transmitting my camera too, but if it is, the router is...
Yeah, we can see the camera. Don't
worry. Okay,
worry.
perfect. So you can see the router is just reboot. So yeah. That's it.
Great info.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really like the session. So we have got few questions here. So sure. The first question is, what is your choice of scanner to detect vulnerabilities in router?
In router, so there is no scanner for vulnerabilities in router. So you have to do everything by hand. If you're interested, I recommend that you read about former vulnerabilities And you have to think of it as, it's all very manual. It's basically like doing a network penetration test and OS, network in OS. So it's not different than attacking, like if you studied something like OSCP, for example, you got a part that is network penetration and a part which is OS reconnaissance. So hacking a router is basically that. You do the network penetration test, and then you do OS penetration test, combine them.
Great. So the second question is, what is the process of for performing reverse engineering in network security or protocols?
For protocols, it's actually something that I personally really like, but it's quite hard, to be honest with you. But I think the reverse engineering process for everything is very generic, right? So you just need, I know it's very hard, and we all been there. And even for me, I don't have a lot of experience, but I have some. And even for me, it's very difficult sometimes, because think of it this way: when you're reverse engineering a protocol, that protocol was made by a person, right? It might be in binary, it might not mean anything to you, but it meant something to a person. So if it meant something for a person, it would mean something to you if you spend long enough analyzing it. I know this is a very generic answer, but if you think about it, this is how it goes. This is how you reverse stuff, right? You stare at it long enough, you think about it long enough, and I'll be able to reverse it and understand it.
All right. This third question that you have already answered. There is no such scanner to detect vulnerabilities in router. But somebody is asking how to detect. I mean, the process of detecting a vulnerability or any open source tool made yet. I mean, of course, you said no.
Not really. I mean, you there are some scanners. You can. I don't remember the names, but there are some firmware scanners. What they do is they download the firmware, and they grab the firmware for vulnerabilities, right? So it depends what you want to achieve. If you want to achieve, let's say, doing a study, because a lot of these tools are made to a study to find out what firmwares from manufacturer have a certain vulnerability, then these tools are useful to use. But what if you want is to hack a specific router? The tool's not going to save you. I mean, me and my colleague Radek, we have some tools we use internally, but these are basically, let's call it pimped up grep. Grep for grepping text files. That's basically it. It's grep patterns. There isn't much more than that. This is a very manual world.
Get it. So, and the last question is, can you share your views on the open standards being worked on in the industry, like Open Wi-Fi, Open WRT, Purple WRT, and such, that are promoting off-the-shelf router platforms, basically driving things to become more hardware agnostic? So
I'm a big fan of Open WRT and DDWRT. I use both. I prefer the DDWRT. Because they give me a better sense of security. So why? Because router manufacturers, they put a lot of, let's call it crap, in their devices. They put a lot of services. When you buy a computer with Windows and it comes pre-installed with all kind of crap that you don't want, right? And you start removing it. So think of your router the same way. A lot of this stuff they add to the router makes you vulnerable. These platforms like OpenWRT, DDWRT, they make it better because they allow you to control what's on the device. However, they do not make it more secure. They don't necessarily make it more secure. It's all about reducing your attack surface. If there's a vulnerability in a process running in DDWRT, well, you're still going to get exploited.
So yeah, that's all. These were the questions from the viewers, and I really appreciate it. Great information. Thank you so much, Pedro, for sharing your insights on network security, devices security, vulnerabilities.
My pleasure.
I really hope the learning would have been worthwhile to our viewers as well. So before we end this, I want to inform all the attendees to check out our latest Dynamic CISO weekly newsletters that consist of latest security vulnerabilities, hacks, malware, and bug bounties related content in one place to help you stay ahead, stay one step ahead. I've shared the newsletter URL in the chat as well. And also, I have shared Pedro's YouTube link as well in the chat. So please check that out. He has shared a lot of videos on, vulnerabilities, these kind of stuff. Really insightful. So that's all. Thanks everyone for joining us. See you again soon.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.